want to start by acknowledging that the resort municipality is grateful to be on the shared unceded territory of the Liwat people, known in their language as Liwatul, and the Squamish people, known in their language as Squamish. We respect and commit to a deep consideration of their history, culture, stewardship, and voice. And particularly thinking about those two communities right now when this whole province is dealing with very difficult times, but certainly those two communities are as well. For those of you who I haven't met, my name's Jack Crompton. I'm the Mayor of Whistler, and on behalf of council and staff, I want to welcome you here tonight. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We're pleased to welcome you to the Maury Young Arts Centre. I hope you had the chance to visit with some of staff and council in the gallery before. Well, the RMOW is excited to be able to offer in-person open houses again, really excited to be able to offer in-person open houses again. We recognize how important virtual and online programming will continue to be. With this in mind, the presentations are being live streamed on whistler.ca and on Facebook at Facebook Live. A warm welcome to those joining us from those locations. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us online. The presentation portion of this meeting will be 1 hour. I will say a few words and then pass it over to our Chief Administrative Officer, Ginny Cullen, to provide a corporate overview, and then Director of Finance, Carly Price, will provide our financial update. Following the presentations from 6 to 6:30 p.m., Mayor and Council, along with RMOW staff, will be available for questions and feedback in the gallery. This meeting is a chance to learn about the opportunities and constraints we are faced with heading into another ambitious year of work on behalf of our resort community. The RMOW has a unique local government mandate to serve Whistler's business community, nearly 12,000 permanent residents, and around 3 million annual visitors. That is unique, as I said. Not every municipality in this province has a tourism mandate like we do. But it is one that we invest time, energy, and money in accomplishing, along with that very important task of serving the people who live here year-round. The municipality manages an annual budget of $100 million and provides municipal programs, services, and infrastructure that touches every aspect of daily life. These services include water and waste management, snow clearing, roads and village maintenance, police, fire and bylaw services, recreation, parks and trails, and transit, library, building, and planning services. In addition, the municipality provides important funding to other nonprofit organizations that deliver services for the community's benefit. The municipal budget is a plan for how we intend to acquire and use resources to attain our objectives for 2022. Throughout the year, Council receives input from the community and makes decisions informed by long-range plans and research, which all have financial implications, as you can imagine. The annual budget process allows us to look at our organization's plans and priorities comprehensively to determine how to deliver them to you in the most fiscally responsible way. It's something we take very seriously. We know going into the budget each year that there are some cost pressures. And also, there are some opportunities for us as a community. This is the 4th budget process I've been a part of as a mayor, and I can assure you we have spent a lot of time considering the priorities and service levels in light of our current reality. Staff, the Audit and Finance Committee, and Council have been reviewing proposed budgets and considering options. Similar to last year, we are paying special attention to our reserve accounts through this budget process to ensure that monies are set aside for the long-term goals of the municipality and that those funds will be available when needed. It's imperative that the RMOW use our financial resources effectively and efficiently. On behalf of council and staff, I invite you to sift through the material presented tonight so that you can ask questions, we can give you some answers, and you can share your ideas with us. You will note that the budget we are proposing is influenced by a number of things. Having been in local government for some time, I have lots of friends from around the province who are involved in local government themselves. One of my closest friends in government is a fellow named Jason Lum. He is a councillor in Chilliwack, and he's currently the chair of the Fraser Valley Regional District. We were on a call earlier today with the province, and he was sharing with 100 mayors and with the provincial government the realities that they face in the Fraser Valley right now. And it was heartbreaking, as you can certainly imagine. It was tough to hear. Afterwards, and I'd be happy to show these pictures, he sent me some pictures of what he was doing 30 minutes before that meeting. And it's a picture of him driving a motorboat with 8 calves crammed into the motorboat with him as he flies across a lake that is much wider than Green Lake, obviously just delivered onto their doorstep. And the barn that he was moving away from had water right up to the top of the head jamb of the barn door. These are heartbreaking scenes, but they are, like what happened this summer and previous summers with fires, really our new reality. And I wanted to mention that today because you will see the impact increasingly of our changing climate on municipal budgets. And you are seeing it here, and you will continue to see it. This year you'll see it through increased fire smart funding, fuel treatment on the forests around us, park upgrades, snow guns to provide fire mitigation if it happens, and also put down snow where cross-country skiing happens, electric car infrastructure, and increased transit service. We, along with every community in this province and around this world, will be investing in mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And I think it's important to acknowledge that you'll see that hit our budgets. There's other things that are hitting our budgets now. This is a really interesting labor market, as you all know if you live in this town. Difficult to hire. That impacts our budget, as does recovery from COVID-19 and many other things. So when I say that we're here to talk about challenges and opportunities, we need to do so in an unflinching way, I think. And so I hope that you will join us in that work. I think it's important work, and I'm grateful to see some familiar faces of people who have done this in the past with us. Your input then was important, and your input now is important, and I am grateful for it. With that, I will invite our Chief Administrative Officer, Ginny Cullen, to begin her presentation. Welcome, Ms. Cullen. Over to you.
Thank you, Jack. Nice to see people here in person. I'm just going to check to make sure that I can do this. Okay. So I'm just going to give some high-level overview of our municipal planning cycle, go through some of our budget considerations, both in terms of an annual picture, as well as what they are for 2022, for the year ahead, and what our current context is. Touch on briefly on the COVID impacts and the recovery. It's infused into everything at this point, but I will speak to it a little bit. And then I will touch on the progress that has been made on the council focus areas in the last 3 years, and talk a little bit about what's planned for 2022. And then finally, I'll touch on staffing levels at the end. So I wanted to put this one up because I was recently at I don't know if it was a committee meeting. It was actually at the Whistler Sessions meeting, and someone came up to me and said, "Where did that come from? It's so good." And I said, "Yeah, it's the vision that was created as part of the OCP, but it is good, and I think we actually need to have it up in front of us more often so that we can see truly what does guide us on a day-to-day basis." I'd like to make T-shirts out of it. Because it really is visionary, and it's also simple. So it is a really good North Star for us to be able to orient all our planning in all of our decisions and activities towards. It has 4 characteristics: the environment, community, tourism, economy, and sense of place. And those are infused in everything we do as well. And also really match well with a lot of the discussions we've been having around what does a strategic recovery look like in Whistler. So at a high level, I just want to just touch on where we are in terms of our annual planning cycle. So in the blue section of this slide are several components of the municipality's annual planning. Council priorities get developed and validated through listening to the community, which happens in many different forums. This budget open house is one of those forums and an important place for community engagement. So again, thank you for coming here today. These council priorities are then used to identify different projects for the year. And they get reflected and outlined in the budget as well. The gold areas in the slide show the guiding plans and regulations that are the landscape within the municipal operations. The past year and a half has highlighted the importance of effective community engagement to determine actions and strategy in an uncertain environment. We have all learned some new skills as we navigate constantly changing conditions, and the resort's success is a result of hard work and determination of community members, partners, and businesses. So if we zoom in on the annual budget square of that slide in the blue part, just for a moment, I will move to where we are in terms of our annual budget planning process, and Carly will touch on this as well. But essentially, we're in the middle of the process in a way. The budget open house is the big orange square there in the middle, and it's an important milestone for staff and council. It allows us to provide all of you with a detailed update on the financial picture of the municipality, including a look into budget considerations for the year ahead. So it's good to point out that the budget process starts near the beginning of summer and continues to be refined through the workshops between senior staff and then between senior staff and council to get it to the place where it is today. All of this is to say is that there's a lot of thinking, analysis, feedback, refinement that's done prior to bringing it here, but all of this is in service of being prepared to bring you the budget in an informed and considered way. So at a high level and on a repetitive annual basis, budget considerations are what we see on this slide. So we have core municipal services that drive the primary component of the budget. We are always thinking in terms of budget. Every decision we make has a budget implication for the most part. Our budget also has to consider always aligning with that community vision that I talked about, and then responding to emerging community needs. And that last one is important because it means that we actually have to have capacity to respond to things. We can't only just be working towards what are planned initiatives. So as we are all aware, COVID has disrupted our economic cycle. We have considerable change in what was happening prior to 2019 versus what we can see now. Not all of it has been, can be seen from a negative lens. However, there's just changes that we need to be cognizant of in terms of our working context right now. With this in mind, I just wanted to touch on as well this concept of resilience. So prior to COVID, the municipality may have been operating more in a planned position, but with the impacts of COVID, and unfortunately in our case with the cyber attack, that kind of pushed us further down this slide and into a more reactive state. And I think our goal over time is to move into a more resilient community and organization so that we can respond appropriately to crises. And we know that there's going to be continuing challenges with climate change that we're going to need to adapt to along the way. And so this just stresses the need to be fiscally prudent, but planning appropriately for what the future may have. So as I think about moving into the 2022 considerations, I talked about the strategic recovery. And this is really bringing into focus the fact that environment and social and community needs need to be considered with the same weight and at the same level as the tourism economy. all of this needs to be considered together. Part of the budget considerations look at removing barriers for economic recovery, so that includes making improvements to customer service, catching up on projects that were delayed as part of the recovery response because we had reduced staffing levels and other considerations. We know that we have increased stress on our parks, and we have not let the foot off the gas in terms of affordable housing. Will remain a really important focus going forward. All of this is also underlined by the Big Move strategy implementation and really moving into detailed planning and development of how that's going to happen in our community going forward. So I just want to touch on, like I said, each of the council focus areas and just speak to some of the progress that we've made in the past 3 years and then what's planned for 2022. So under housing, 2021 was a big year for the Cheakamus Crossing Phase 2 project. It broke ground, and there is a building, if you haven't gone by, that is very much fully formed, and we'll be looking to have those buildings ready, and 2 buildings ready in 2022. And we also had a number of private developments that progressed towards rezoning and development. We did an update of housing agreements so that we could align our private developments with the already existing affordable housing programs. And then we also looked to expanding our planning team so that we could respond and accelerate the applications that were coming through. So as I spoke to, we'll continue with the work for Cheakamus Crossing in 2022. There's also, not on this slide, but there's a big development with Northlands that is ongoing as well. It'll be part of the work plan. We have the private developments that will be continuing through the application process, and also continuing to look at other tools that are available to us in terms of housing, including review of the infill housing options. So moving on to climate action, in 2021, we adopted the Big Move strategy. We also looked at increasing transportation option, especially as it relates to the summer experience plan. We had a successful park shuttle program through the summer. We increased our bike valet, and we got a number of bikes kind of out of the parks and into the valet, and an increased usage of that service. We had new valley trail sections built, and we also looked at some improvements under the Buildings Department and Planning Department for step code implementation and green building policy. So moving forward in 2022, the discussion around regional transit has been renewed. So there is some encouraging progress in those discussions in the last couple months. So that will be another focus for 2022. Some improvements with waste management. So our team is going to be looking at three-stream waste implementation in the village to improve on what we see as some contamination of the waste stream. There will continue to be wildfire prevention work that will be incredibly and continue to be important here in Whistler. And then on all of our projects, there are climate considerations. So kind of similar to what I said with COVID, those considerations are somewhat infused into our work. The same is with climate. It is considered with everything that we are doing. And finally, the council did add a 4th focus area at the end of last year, and that has to do with pandemic recovery. So, there were a number of different initiatives that were put in place to help local businesses as we responded to the new rules and restrictions that COVID brought to us, patio expansions being one of them. We also helped quite a bit with the vaccination clinics that were brought to Whistler. We were one of the most successful places in BC in terms of mass vaccination and vaccination rates. And then we also brought together the Whistler Recovery Working Group. So I think I'm running a bit long, so I'm going to move past this one because I spoke at this one at length at the Committee of the Whole. So we've basically moved the Whistler Recovery Working Group into what is now called the Whistler Sessions. And in that, we will be developing a number of stories of possible futures that will help guide us through the recovery and basically towards that vision that we were that we're always looking at. For community balance, there's a number of different initiatives here. The most substantive is actually related to our strategic planning committee, and they're looking at, and our economic development team are looking at a balance model. And this model is going to help us basically test different scenarios in the community to help us understand what areas of our municipal system will be stressed under different growth scenarios. So this gives you an idea of kind of what we'll be looking at. Right now, we're sitting in basically between the one on the left-hand side, the current state assessment, and the potential future scenarios. So at this point, we've finished bringing all the data and info together to create that baseline, and now we're thinking and looking at how do we stress this model to look at what we want to know and understand about the community as we move forward in time and plan effectively for future visitation. Here's a number of balance model focus areas to give you an idea of what's being looked at and why this is under the community balance focus area. So community character, affordability, pace and scale of population growth, resilience to changing weather patterns, all of these things would be touched on, although not looked at in detail, but they would provide places for different teams to look at and know and understand. So I did promise I wanted to touch on staffing levels at the end. So part of our salary costs this year include new roles that were added to the team in September. These roles were added to add resources to departments that didn't have enough people to work to get through the workload that they have in front of them. This will help and improve on basically wait times and customer service. We also have all of our casual staff levels back to normal following the COVID-related layoffs, so we do have a full team from that perspective, which is great. We did a really detailed look at how Whistler staffing levels compare to other municipalities. And if you look at us and compare us to municipalities of similar scope, complexity, size, Whistler staffing levels actually plot near the lower end of that. This also coupled with the size of the RMOW team, the staff team, has not been adequately scaled with the growth of residents and visitors over time. So to just illustrate that very quickly, the resort has grown in the last 10 years. This is just taking one metric to illustrate that. This is number of visitors over time. You'll see that there's actually an acceleration once you get past 2014. So if you keep that in your mind and then you move to the next slide, these are our staffing levels. Although they're not the same scales, and my engineering friends would get mad at me for showing these, but essentially what you can see is that even though you have an increase in visitation rates, we have kept staffing levels pretty static. And while some people would see that as a success, I don't actually see that as good organizational development or planning. This puts stress on a system, puts stress on the people who deliver the services to the municipality. All of these different unintended consequences result when you don't adequately resource your organization for the work that it needs to do. This is also further amplified in the current climate because we know there's a staffing shortage out there, and the retention of staff is even more important than it's ever been. So I will pass it to Carly in a moment, but I do want to mention one last thing before I do, and that's just when we're talking about investment in our infrastructure and making sure that we are planned and resilient for the future. I would say that the care and maintenance of the people in the operation that operate it and make it happen and bring the service to the community is the most important asset to invest in. Thank you.
Thanks, Ginny. Thanks for providing that critical community context for the 2022 budget. We'll spend the next 25 minutes or so looking at the components, the specific components of the 2022 RMOW budget. And the first thing we'll need to do as we continue on that path is to have a look at the budget overall. What you'll see here is the various distinct funds that compose together the municipal budget. So keep in mind that each of these has a unique funding source and is set to accomplish unique things. Money cannot move between these funds, and again, their objectives are different and distinct. In order to understand the municipal budget, we need to begin with some basic building blocks. As I mentioned, each fund has a specific mandate and is funded separately. When we talk about general municipal fund, this funds things that are non-utility related and non-tourism related. The general fund receives non-tax revenue as well as tax money, and these two together need to match the operating expenditures of that fund. Expenditures include both operations and also reserve contributions. When we think about operating expenditures, keep in mind that these reflect a growing suite of delivered services, and that in the case of reserve contributions, our asset base that underlies these amounts is growing and aging. Graphically, this looks like so. Incoming are the tax revenues and the non-tax revenues. Money flows out in the form of expenditures and then also into reserve contributions. Also in any year, there are project expenditures, and you'll see on the tables in the gallery a list of projects planned for 2022. These are also funded out of reserves. So with those building blocks in mind, we can move and look at the specific expenditures on specific funds, starting with utilities funds and tourism. Utilities funds, as you know, provide essential services to the community. These include water, sanitary, sewer, and solid waste. Funding is required for the maintenance of these assets that support these service deliveries, as well as the folks who work in those operations. Important to note here is that a significant renewal is underway, particularly in the sewer fund. The sewer reserve will need to be rebuilt starting in 2025, and we do expect the water and the solid waste reserves to grow over time as well. For these reasons, we're proposing a 3% increase in utilities rates and parcel taxes for 2022. Here you'll see graphically the sewer reserve over time. So on the x-axis, you've got time, and then on the y-axis, you've got value. What this graph shows is the changing reserve balances reflective of both the contributions that move into those specific reserves and the spending that flows out of them. In blue, you've got water, in orange, sewer, and in gray, solid waste. As we move towards the right of this chart, you'll see those sewer reserves being moved lower. There's roughly $40 million in sewer spending planned in the 5-year horizon, all of which is important and essential work to support the infrastructure of the community, but it does also serve to draw those reserves down. This isn't unhealthy reserve behavior, so long as a period of low spending follows, which is what we expect, and that those contributions remain at appropriate levels. Moving on to the tourist-funded funds, RMI and MRDT are also separate from the general municipal tax pool. The tourist revenues received by the community from the province must be used for specific tourist-related things. The list of allowed expenditures using these funds is determined annually in collaboration with the province and must be used for things that are tourist-facing and that don't benefit residents. RMI specifically is focused on visitor amenities at this time, including the construction of the village washrooms and extensive work at the parks. The RMI program is up for renewal in 2022, and so the list of projects that you see with this budget version includes only those projects that have already been approved. Additional works could and likely will be added mid-year when clarity on funding amounts is achieved. Moving on to the general municipal fund, and again keeping in mind the building blocks of our budget, you'll see a summary of the general municipal budget here. We are seeing increases in general operating expenditures. The numbers on the screen are after RMI and MRDT funded operating expenditures and before reserve contributions. We're seeing an increase in non-tax revenue amounts in 2022 and also an increase in reserve contributions. This does bring the reserve contributions in 2022 back to 2019 levels, and here I'd note that this change is not enough. We do need to ensure that those reserves are funded appropriately, and the change that we propose for 2022 should be considered the first of several steps on that path. We are considering a 4 to 5 year horizon to bring those reserve contributions in line with where they ought to be. Now, this chart shows how those budget components combine to inform the property tax change over time going back to 2014. It's a lot to take in. You'll see, again, time on the bottom axis and value on the left axis. The different colored bars represent different components of the budget. In gray is the property tax requisition. And then the smaller bars represent the year-over-year change. So as you move from gray bar to gray bar, you can see the different components that drive the change from year to year. Orange is non-tax revenue, and you'll see that in most year that number is a net credit to property tax. In blue, you've got operating expenditures, and then in yellow, reserve contributions. Here's a zoom in, and again, if we're talking data, the broken axis here is going to be a problem, but it's simply the top end of this chart. Same data, easier to read. So again, with this chart, what you're seeing is the components that underlie the year-over-year change in property tax requisition going back to 2015. Important to note in 2020, is that revenues were impacted negatively. That meant that revenue, rather than being a credit against property taxes and allowing property taxes to be smaller, actually created greater demand. We were missing revenue in 2020 that we otherwise would have brought in. This meant that items that normally would have grown in 2020 from prior years, including operating expenditure and reserve contributions, were actually down. In the case of reserve contributions, you've already heard me point these out as unsustainable. So in both 2021 and again in 2022, those reserve contributions need to increase, not only to recapture the amounts that were forfeited in 2020, but also to consider the growth in the asset base during that time. Moving on to the next component of budget building is the non-tax revenue. So growth in non-tax revenue can serve to reduce the required tax requisition amount. Non-tax revenue can take on a variety of different forms, things like parking fees and fines, transit fares, permits, and admissions and programs or passes at Meadow Park Sports Center. From 2012 to 2019, these items together created $3.6 million in new net revenue for the municipality. And you'll see on the pie chart there how that $3.6 million breaks down into the component parts. Now in 2020, obviously those revenues were set back. We regained some of that lost revenue in 2021, and we'll do so again in 2022, but we are not yet back to pre-COVID levels of non-tax revenue in the general fund. Now, I said that non-tax revenue growth reduces the required tax requisition, and I add the caveat here that this is true in some cases. Some non-tax revenues simply serve to reduce the net cost of delivering the service. So setting user costs is an important part of the community conversation, and in programs like transit, Meadow Park, and recreation, the intent is that fees simply offset a portion of the program cost. These programs together were worth $8.3 million in revenues in 2019, offsetting $13.3 million in costs, and each was, in fact, hard hit by the pandemic. In 2020 alone, these lost $2.5 million in combined revenue, and again, those amounts have not yet come back. So when it comes to non-tax revenue, the partially funded programs are not as effective in offsetting tax requisitions as some other categories. For other categories, there can be meaningful change by adjusting those values upwards in what the amount of weight that falls to property tax to offset. These include things like parking and permits. In these types of categories, the user pays the full amount of the cost, and in some cases, we use these fees to help motivate behavior. In the case of parking, we use fees to help incentivize transportation mode shift. So we ask people who choose to park instead of biking or walking to pay a little bit more. In permits, we're targeting very specific groups of users, people who choose to rebuild their homes, and again, we're looking for those folks to pay more of the full cost of those services. Increases to these types of non-revenue programs are possible in 2022 and in every year. Just to spend a quick moment on parking in particular, parking has been a very reliable source of non-tax revenue growth for many years. And here I'd note the path going forward is less certain. So here we're looking between 2013 and 2019, parking contributed 0.67% each year on average, reduction in what otherwise would have been the property tax increase rate. This happened because new parking programs were introduced and utilization across the parking inventory increased. With those two things in mind, we can fairly expect the contribution of this program in the future to be less. Day lots are currently operating at capacity in season, and new parking locations are difficult to find. So in total, we can expect parking to be less of a contribution going forward, and that absent new sources of non-tax revenue, the weight that falls on tax requisition to fund growing municipal responsibilities increases. Moving on to operating expenditures. The question here is, why do RMOW expenditures increase? One of the most common questions we get at budget time is why there needs to be any expansion in the municipal budget at all. Why can't we spend the same this year as we did last year? And simply put, the reason the municipal budget expands is because the scope of our work constantly expands. Since 2012, there's been over 200,000 annual hours of work added to the municipal budget. 50% of this has been funded by tourism revenues, and the rest by taxes. Areas of increased attention in the time spent by the municipality align with community needs. So hours have been added where there is a real and novel need. Things like bylaw, overnight accommodation enforcement. Things like the library, which added casual hours when the new building was introduced. Things like planning, village events and animation, which again is funded by tourism revenues. All of these areas are identified pockets of need by the community in these years and have gotten the attention they deserve. Likewise, we're seeing regular cost inflation in key service contracts. So the RMOW contracts out of the general fund about $16 million each year to third parties. Two important third parties are, of course, the RCMP and BC Transit. These two together represent about $10.3 million in the current budget. And finally, the volume of capital works increases over time. We're building new things and replacing old things as they age. Whistler assets have a somewhat unique age profile in that the village sort of grew out of the earth all at once, as opposed to communities that have maybe been around longer. What that means is that things tend to come up for renewal all at the same time. This is a different problem that may be faced by communities with a longer history. And again, with projects, delivery of projects requires significant internal resources in addition to what we require to operate municipal services. So when thinking about the operating expenditures in the 2022 budget, the key message is that the increase is reflective of the budgeted workload. Demands on the RMOW have changed, and the workforce needs to change as well. Ginny already mentioned the staff additions planned for 2022. This is somewhat unique and particular to this current year and reflects a backlog of several years of very small staffing changes. The goal with the operating expenditures is successful delivery of initiatives and improved service delivery. Staffing additions are planned in planning and building, parks capital, and of course the core municipal operations, including IT, legislative services, and finance. Looking outside the RMLW payroll, there was an RCMP contract settlement in 2021 that affects the costs of that contract going forward, and net transit costs that are still quite high. We will be drawing down our BC Transit Reserve in 2022, as we did in 21 and will again in 23, but the net costs of that program still are out of line with what we might normally expect. And finally, to reserve contributions. Mayor Crompton spoke about this, as did Ginny. The key message, of course, is that reserve are essential savings that support the RMOW's built infrastructure. We set aside reserves because they are the savings account that allows us to take care of our installed asset base, allows us to consider the replacement costs that sometimes fall well into the future, and also allow us to consider the expected lifespan on the assets in our care. Reserve contributions also allow us to assign the cost of deterioration in our asset base to the folks who use it. So by funding reserve contributions in any given year, a ratepayer is acknowledging the deterioration of that asset base in the year that they are funding. By moving around reserve contributions from year to year, we lose contact with that idea a little bit. And when we think about the increases that are now necessary, some of that has to do with the relief that we provided to the community in 2020 and 2021, primarily through changed reserve contributions. The other important role that reserve contributions play is to ensure that spending, although it's very lumpy, when a roof needs to be replaced on a building, it can be a very high-ticket item, but the contributions funding that replacement have come in over a series of years and thus dampened the year-to-year volatility in the amount of funding that's required from the community. So just a quick look back on the general capital spending. So again, we're thinking about reserve and we're thinking about reserve contributions, we must also think about project spending. So project spending is essentially the manifestation of the reserve contributions. We spend on projects in many cases to replace things that are aged, and in some cases to build things that address new demands in the community. This chart here shows budgeted spending from the General Capital Fund back to 2010. You'll see that the current plans are many multiples higher than what plans were some 8-9 years ago, but the reserve contributions have not increased to the same extent. What that means is that reserve balances, and here again you'll see the balance in dollars on the left and the years along the bottom axis. What you'll see here is those contributions in blue rising sharply in the 2008 to 2014, which was the direct result of high tax increases and a deliberate focus on building reserve balances, but also benefited from low spending in those years. When we look forward, we're seeing again an aspiration to higher contributions, but that the reserve balances do not respond in the same way, in part because the project spending need is so much greater than it was years ago. So higher contributions at this time help to address the shortfall relative to what we're spending, but fail to build the reserves in the way that we would like, and that's a conversation that we will have in subsequent years. Thinking very simply about reserves, we can use our trusty bathtub metaphor. So the contributions are essentially filling up the tub, the reserve balance is the water level, and then the drain is the project spending. So we're looking to dial up the faucet to some extent to acknowledge the fact that that drain hole is just getting bigger because of the state of our assets. And again, this is a 4 to 5 year problem that we're looking to solve, starting with a small increase in reserve contributions in 2022. So in summary, the volume of the work continues to grow, and with it, operating expenditures. Here we'd like to hear from you. Community input is critical to refining our service mix. The budget is constructed around what we expect the community expects for the coming year. If those assumptions are different, we need to hear from you. Are there things that you don't see in the budget that you'd like to, or services that you think can be discontinued, changes that can be made? This is the sort of feedback that can help us at this stage of the budget process. Also note that the volume of projects is going to continue to increase. Our assets are aging and new things are being added. You can see this in the 5-year project plan on the tables outside. One thing we know is that project spending must be more closely matched with reserve contributions and the emergency fund rebuilds. Part of the reason that we were able to offer tax relief to ratepayers in 2020 is because we had a healthy operating reserve balance. Rebuilding that operating reserve is critical to funding any unforeseen circumstances that may emerge in the future, whether that's fire, whether that's flood, whether that's pandemic. Having that money in reserve at the time those disasters strike is critical to this community and something that's worth a good deal of our attention. And finally, the COVID-19 effect on non-tax revenues is enduring into 2022. Obviously, the village has been very busy this summer. Tourism is coming back, but not nearly at the pace that we might have hoped. So in summary, the proposed changes to taxes and fees for 2022 include a 6.72% increase in general municipal tax and a 3% increase in utility parcel tax and user fees. Another question that we get a lot is whether the RMOW is delivering services efficiently and do taxes in Whistler represent good value? That second question is one that I cannot answer and is up to every individual homeowner to answer themselves. But what we can say is that over longer horizons, Whistler has indeed provided more than a decade of low tax increases to ratepayers. This graphic comes from the City of Vancouver budget book and compares 10 years of tax increases in communities across the Lower Mainland. You'll see the average in the yellow bar towards the right of the chart, and I've added Whistler in the red bar to the left. So Whistler over 10 years, and this chart ends in 2020, increased taxes on average 1.71% compared to that average, which is just above 3%. If we were to include 2021 in this chart, the Whistler number would be 1.41%, and all of those blue bars would shift to the right. The question we need to ask is, at what point does a commitment to low tax increases overshoot the mark? So on this slide, you'll see the tax assessment per $1,000 of property value in various communities across Canada. Again, you've got Vancouver on the far left of this chart at $2.93, and then Whistler at $2.81, even further to the left. What are the consequences of another 10 years of low tax increases? And is it time to think in new ways about resourcing and funding the work that is both necessary and essential to maintain the vibrancy of this community going forward? Work requires funding, and funding in this case needs to come from taxes. So while we're sure that the response to the 6.72% might be alarmed, we want to encourage folks to think of this in a multi-year period and to think of the importance, again, of maintaining the vibrancy of this community and rising to the challenges that we face today, perhaps not what we faced 10 years ago. So what does this all mean for individual taxpayers? Quick reminder that your property tax bill, which looks probably quite like this, includes not only municipal taxes and fees, but also provincial charges. So the amounts that you see at the bottom are not entirely coming back to the municipality. It's only the amounts in the bottom that are municipal responsibilities. The rest we simply pass through to those provincial agencies. First up is utility, parcel taxes, and fees. On the leftmost column on this table, you'll see the 2021 rates. These amounts are paid per property and have no relationship to that property's value. So everyone in the community pays the same amount for sewer, water, and solid waste. You pay these fees when you're connected to the sanitary sewer system and or when you use things like the solid waste depot if you're in a non-strata property. On the rightmost column of this table, you'll see the proposed 2022 rates. Altogether, it represents about a $36.15 increase per property, provided that the property pays all these fees and taxes on their property tax bill. And then general municipal tax, this is again for a sample property worth $1.5 million. The municipal tax amount in 2021 on this property would be $2,313, and the effect of the proposed change for 2022 would be $2,469 for a $114 year-over-year increase. Quick reminder on the calculation of general municipal tax. So the tax rate increase that is proposed applies to the total tax pool. Allocation of those amounts to individual properties depends on the value of those properties. The year-over-year change on an individual property depends on the relative change in valuation of that property versus the community. Properties that increase more quickly than the community average will pay a year-over-year property tax amount that varies by a greater amount than the announced rate change. Conversely, properties that appreciate more slowly will see their property tax bill grow more slowly and may even see a contraction from year to year. The average expected increase for Whistler this year is currently estimated on residential properties for about 30%. Any property in this community that appreciates by less than 30% for the 2022 tax year will see a significantly lower increase in their property tax bill than the announced rate. And with that, I will almost hand it back to Mayor Crompton. Just one quick look back. Ginny introduced this slide. This is, again, the overall budget view. We are right now sitting inside the little orange square on this table, and we'll proceed from here to collect community input, do further refinements to the budget, and then come back before this community and before council on December 18th with budget guidelines. We definitely want to hear from you. We have extensive new online tools with which you can engage and provide us with your feedback. As in every year, you can send us an email with your comments and questions. You can email your counselors, and we again would really like to hear from you. We do serve at the end of the day everybody in this room and everybody in this community, and hearing from you is critical to ensuring that the service mix that we propose and the funding model that we propose is the right one for the community. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mayor Crompton.
Thank you very much, Carly. That was a great presentation, I thought. Now is our chance to answer some of your questions if you have them. So if you have a question, please come to the mic and you can ask it, and I may answer it myself, or I may defer to someone more equipped than I, of which there are many in this room. So please come to the mic and ask your question. Go ahead, Dean. If you don't have questions or comments, that's fine. We will be happy to take those, like Carly said, to our emails as counselors, or participate online and give us those there. If you can state your name and address, and then you can ask your question, please. I believe, are we allowed to take off masks at the mic, or no?
Yeah.
Keep your mask
people can
on.
Hear me, that's fine.
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear.
All right. So my name is Sean Easton. I'm here representing Zero Ceiling Society of Canada. I'm one of the co-executive directors. Thank you for the presentation. I had questions in relation to the RCMP contract. And we, as a social service provider, think there's value in potentially having RCMP unit, as we've talked about briefly before, Mayor Crompton, that has a mental health component to it. I know you guys are looking at the possibility of doing something like that, and I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to reallocate some of the funding within the RCMP contract to support such a unit. So that potentially might mean losing one officer to replace it with a mental health professional to ride along.
As I said to you on the phone, I think this budget cycle is just too short to make changes like this at that point. But certainly it's a topic of conversation that is great to raise here. I won't say absolutely no, but I'll turn it over to Ted. Okay, Mr. Battiston, to come to the front and tell us all about the RCMP contract. Thanks for the question, by the way.
So I appreciate the question. My name is Ted Battiston. I'm the General Manager of Corporate and Community Services. I do manage the RCMP contract. As noted in this budget, the RCMP contract is a large expenditure for the community. The change in the collective agreement has resulted in a significant change in that contract year over year. It's a little more than $500,000 more than it was the previous year in our budget. The conversations about the makeup of the team is something that we discuss often. In fact, we discussed it earlier today. This issue did come up only just a couple of hours ago. There is a process that the federal government structures that we as a local government and council in particular considers the resourcing levels of the RCMP year to year. It's because of the different fiscal year for the federal government and the RCMP versus ours. We're on a calendar year. Their year end is at the end of March. The processes don't line exactly up. So any consideration of further changes, whether that's an additional mental health unit, whether it's a couple of years ago we did add a domestic violence individual that became a dedicated resource. That comes from our council through something called the letter of agreement, which then goes to the federal government. They recruit for that role. The time frame, as the mayor mentioned, is almost 12 months between when we say that this is something that we're interested in. It goes through the process. They recruit for it. Sometimes they have to train for it, then they recruit for it, and then we might have it in our teams. So it is something that over the first quarter of 2022 is a conversation that we will be having as a community and with council as to those resources. But as the mayor said, even if that was to decide on a resource such as what you're suggesting, just being honest that by the time that actually lands on the ground, that would probably be something at least 6 months later, probably more like 12 months later. So the process is a somewhat slow process through the federal government, but it is a conversation that we're actively having. We're tracking metrics related to mental health to know what the need is and to present the rationale in front of, to council, and then to step forward with a potential letter of agreement in the future. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate that. I would love the opportunity to contribute to those conversations as a social service leader in the community. And I think we all within the social service sector recognize that we're under-resourced from a mental health perspective in town. We have a great mental health team, but very little crisis supports. And I've worked alongside units in Vancouver that have such a model. It's incremental what it does, so I think it would really help to round out the services that are here locally, and it would be a great start in building out a more robust mental health support system for this community, which we all know we need more of it more than ever as a result of COVID. So yeah, thank you for your clarity, and yeah, hopefully we can be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Easton. Appreciate the question. Any other questions for us? Comments? Don't be shy.
Do I have to introduce myself, like telling the questions at a council meeting?
Yes, sorry, your name and address.
Sue Maxwell, 9571 Emerald Drive. I just wanted to say thanks. It's I think, a really good forward-thinking budget. I'm really excited, sadly, to see that the taxes will be going up because I'm hoping to live here for a long time. So I think it's really important that we have appropriate reserves set aside and appropriate staffing to deliver the services. So I think this while it might cost a bit more, it is definitely a very positive step in terms of having a sound financial plan for the community. So thank you for taking that step.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maxwell. Any other questions or comments?
Paul Dorland, Old Mill Lane. Following up on the last comment, I think I have a question for Carly. What is the capital reserve balance now? Where do you hope to get it to in the next few years? And if you compare that to the depreciation report, and you talked about the aging assets, what sort of financial position do we expect to be in, say, 5 or 10 years out?
Yeah, so I apologize, I did not bring my laptop, so I don't have specific numbers for you, but I can tell you that the general capital fund balance has not changed since 2015. And our asset base in that time has grown significantly. There were 2 separate long-term asset management plan studies done, one in 1999 and one in 2004, and each suggested a general capital fund balance over $40 million. And we're right now around, I believe it's 20 million. So we're not anywhere near what we imagined to be necessary in those past studies. We are currently at work on a long-term asset management plan that will reset those numbers and give us greater clarity, but it feels like the number needs to be bigger by a healthy amount, and we'll be able to get much more specific about what that healthy amount is in the next 2 or 3 years, but for now we know we're just under reserved.
An interesting person to talk about long-term asset management and our facilities is Mr. Chalk, who's right there. He's been doing a lot of work on facilities and buildings and understanding what we have built and what it'll cost to replace them. So in the front after, he might be a good person to chat up. Other questions or comments? Okay. If you would like to chat to any of us, we will be out front afterwards, and I see a number of members of council here and lots of staff. And again, I want to say thank you for taking time out of your schedule. I expect, and I want to pass on, I think we're going to have a busier road over the next little while, so pay attention to that. There will be more people coming through our community, and take the opportunity to show them some kindness. I think that this is a time in our province where the kind of kindness that Whistlerites show is needed a lot right now, and you'll see a lot of those people coming through our community, so I encourage you to reach out and warmly greet those people that are traveling through our community because they can't go in other directions. We have some time now to hear your feedback over the next couple weeks, and we're eager to hear it. So please share the information that you've received tonight. Please tell your friends about it, and please let them know that on our website and on Facebook and to each member of council, there are opportunities to provide comments, to ask questions, to participate in the discussion of where we all go from here. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Look forward to seeing you in the front foyer. Have a great night.